In this 25th chapter of Genesis, the story shifts from Abraham to Isaac, but only after a short postscript on Abraham's last years. We read in verse 1, Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. After the death of his beloved Sarah, Abraham remarried a woman named Keturah. Though Abraham is ancient, apparently he's still able to father children. Only 6 sons are named here. It would be odd if only boys were born to Keturah. There were likely some daughters as well, but they aren't mentioned because it was only boys who'd grow to be men whose names would then be passed on to the tribes that they were the ancestors of. And most notably here, we find the name Midian, the patriarch of what will become a major Middle East people group, the Midianites. In verses 3 and 4, we have then the names of the 6 sons. They also become the heads of tribes who populated the Middle East, some of whom ended up giving Isaac's descendants a lot of trouble in much later times. Verse 3, Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were... Now, we could insert a definite article, the, here, because the 3 names that follow are names of tribes. Asherim, Letushim, and Leumim. And the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanach, Abidah, and Eldaah. All these were the children of Keturah, and Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines, which Abraham had, and while he was still living, he sent them eastward away from Isaac his son to the country of the east. Now in verse 1, Keturah is identified as Abraham's second wife. Her name means perfumed, which likely means that she was pleasant to be around. Verse 32 of 1 Chronicles chapter 1 says that Keturah was his concubine. She started a concubine, but then became his official wife. It seems that Abraham had other binds that he'd concubed because they had children by him too. Now, we learn something disturbing here about Abraham, a hero of the faith, one marked out in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11 as an example for us to follow. So let's be careful exactly what Hebrews 11 commends us to follow. We know that God's plan for marriage is one man and one woman for life. Modern notions, of course, push back on that, but they do not use the Bible to support their view. Abraham seems to have pretty carefully adopted that view by having only one wife, Sarah, until she passed. And then he married Keturah. There was a short detour, you'll remember, in the surrogacy of Hagar that produced Ishmael. That detour was urged on Abraham by Sarah, something she quickly came to regret. But the point stands. Abraham only had one wife at a time. That was rather unlike the practice of wealthy, powerful men in that day. But now we learn that Abraham had concubines with whom he'd had children. And thinking biblically, that was just morally wrong. But, if I may bring a little historical perspective for a moment, this in no way excuses Abraham. He shows that he understood God's plan for marriage by only having one wife at a time. But that makes his having concubines all the more problematic. As is so often the case, a little historical perspective may move us to see things in a slightly different light. Not only did ancient rulers and men of wealth and influence have multiple wives, they had concubines who were sort of like unofficial wives. The main reason for so many wives and concubines was mainly, not solely, but mainly, a prestige thing. The idea was, hey, look at how huge my family is. I got to support all of these. I must be rich and powerful. Well, that was the main point. There was a far more practical reason. The mortality rate in pregnancy, infancy, and among young children was incredibly high. Having more wives and concubines increased the chance that your family line would continue to future generations. Now, in an agricultural community, the more hands, the less work, and the greater the production, which meant more food, which meant greater health for the family, and more income from the sale of the surplus. The larger the family, the better chance at being able to defend your ground, your home, your farm, and then village and town and city. Now, here's another important consideration. Men did the fighting and the raiding. Their deaths meant a higher ratio of women to men. In the cultures of the ancient Middle East, a woman's fate was totally tied up in the men of her life. First her father and then her husband, and finally her son when her husband passed. So men of means often took on concubines and had children by them as a way, well, to provide for these single women. As long as they were in his home, he took care of them. When he was gone, the children he had with her would take on the responsibility. Again, that doesn't justify Abraham having concubines, but it does give a little different perspective on the setting. Let's leave it to God to deal with Abraham on that score. Interesting that there's no condemnation of him here, just the simple statement that he had children by women other than Sarah and Keturah. These children couldn't hang around once he was out of the picture because they'd compete with Isaac for control of the inheritance. And so Abraham provisioned them with plenty of resources to start their own families, and he sent them eastward. Verse 7. This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. 175, that's old. And some say it's too old. Evidence of the distorted numbers in the Bible. Now, without getting deep into the scholarly weeds on this, some scholars maintain that the numbers given in the Bible are mostly untrustworthy. They say that the long ages given in the early chapters of Genesis for people, along with some of the population numbers, are grossly exaggerated. There are good reasons for pushing back that skepticism I'm not going to go into now. I did deal with it in an earlier episode. For now, if people lived for 7, 8, even 9 centuries before the flood, because of earth conditions and the purity of the human genome, it's not unreasonable to assume that it took a while after the flood for that genome to build up the flaws that saw a reduction in lifespan. Abraham lived about 2000 BC, when living to a greatly advanced age by our standards was probably common. At the end of verse 5, when it says that Abraham was gathered to his people, it has two things in view. His spirit went to where his ancestors had gone, and his body was entombed with those of his household who died over the years, which is what we read next, verse 9. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. At Abraham's death, Isaac sent word to his half-brother Ishmael. And when he arrived, they buried their father's body alongside Sarah in the cave at Machpelah that Abraham had purchased from Ephron the Hittite. Now it's been 70 years since Ishmael and Isaac have seen each other. Isaac is about 75 at this point, Ishmael 88. Now think of it. It's been 70 years of unresolved hostility and bitterness between Isaac and his brother Ishmael. But now, as they stand before the cave of Machpelah, it seems they're reconciled. It took a death to reconcile them. Reconciliation requires death. God reconciled us through the death of his Son, who died in our place, taking the just penalty of our sins on himself and paying it at the cross. 2 Corinthians says, "Now all things are of God, who has reconciled us to himself through Jesus Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation." Just as our reconciliation to God required the death of Christ, if there's to be reconciliation between those of us who are estranged from one another, someone has to die. Die to self, to the right to revenge, getting even, proving myself right and you wrong. Now, verse 11. And it came to pass, after the death of Abraham, that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahairoi. Beer Lahairoi was the well in the south of Canaan where, you may remember, Hagar had her encounter with God when she'd been booted from Abraham's camp, and assumed that it was the end of hers and Ishmael's story. God opened her eyes to see the well, which she named the well of the living one who sees me. Verses 12 through 16 list Ishmael's dozen sons. Verse 12. Now this is the genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maidservant, bore to Abraham. And these were the names of the sons of Ishmael, by their names, according to their generations. the firstborn of Ishmael, Nebahath, then Kedar, then Abdil, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tamar, Jetur, Nephish, and Kedemah. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these were their names, by their towns and their settlements, 12 princes according to their nations. These were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt as you go towards Assyria. He died in the presence of all his brethren. Ishmael's descendants settled the Negev region of southern Israel and then crossed over into Arabia to become, the main Arabian tribes. Verse 19. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padanaram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now, we read Rebekah's story in the previous chapter. Verse 21. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Isaac's life is similar to his father's in several regards. Right off, we learn that Rebekah, like Sarah, was barren. Verse 26 says that they were childless for 20 years, but when Isaac pleaded with God, his wife conceived. Now, the lesson wasn't lost on Isaac. He was well aware of the circumstances surrounding his own birth. Rebekah's barrenness, with God's gracious response to his prayer, brought home to him the reality that he was indeed the son of promise, through whom the promise that God made his father would be fulfilled. Just as he was a miracle, so his descendants would be as well, a testimony to the goodness and the power of God. So Rebekah conceived, but her pregnancy proved difficult. Verse 22. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, if all is well, why am I like this? And so she went to inquire of the Lord. There was something unusual about her pregnancy. The movement of an unborn child is normal. What was happening in Rebekah's womb was not normal. There was way too much activity, and at times it seemed violent. And so she sought insight from God. How she did that, we're not told, nor do we read how God replied. And that's really for the best, because if we were told, people would have made this into a formula. They would have written books, manuals, staged seminars on how to figure out what God's doing. God wants us to seek him and have a relationship with him. He doesn't want us to see him as some kind of a divine slot machine where we stick in a quarter and get a supernatural gumball or a can of spiritual mojo. I've walked with God for several decades, and I'm leery of gimmickry that gets attached to the faith. Listen, you can't reduce your walk with God to a formula that you work any more than you can turn your marriage into a routine or a formula. It has to stay living, fresh, dynamic. It has to grow. Rebekah sought God, and he answered. How, we don't know, and it's best we don't know. Verse 23, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples shall be separated from your body, 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So Rebekah learned that she was carrying twins, and it wasn't an amiable womb share ride. What was happening inside of her was a prelude to the way that it was going to be once the children were born. In the ancient world, the firstborn son was the premier child. He received the birthright and the patriarchal blessing. The firstborn carried the family name and legacy. The father assigned whatever inheritance that he desired to the firstborn, almost always the entire estate. It was up to the firstborn then to decide how much he would give to his siblings. God set all of that aside in the case of these twins. The order would be reversed. The younger would receive the firstborn rights and portion. Why? And the answer is, why not? Some people are upset at the seeming arbitrariness of God's action here. But hold on. Where does it say that the firstborn is owed special privilege? Is that in the Bible? Is it either explicit or implicit in the creation order? Did God say, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and give favor to the firstborn? It's not there anywhere. Maybe it's a subpoint to one of the 10 commandments. Honor your father and mother and greatly privilege the firstborn. Nope, it's not there either. It was a cultural thing, and God wasn't bound to it. though he does use the human idea of the firstborn privilege as an idiom of his favor. So back to the question, why did God choose to favor the younger child to be born to Isaac and Rebekah? Well, why not? What we want to guard against is assuming that it was arbitrary. God is never, ever arbitrary. Everything he does is perfect in counsel, perfect in wisdom, utterly right and good. In the absence of detailed reasons for the actions and choices of God, we lean on what we do know, and that is this: God is good. Friends, never forsake what you do know about God for what you don't. Verse 24, so when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb, and the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, and so they called his name Hairy Esau. Now Esau was the original Carrot Top, but it wasn't just his head that had red hair. He was a little red furball. Verse 26, afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and so his name was called Heel Catcher, Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. If Isaac was 60 when the twins were born, that means their grandfather Abraham saw them grow to the age of 15 before he passed. Twins are often born several minutes apart, but not in this case. Jacob gripped Esau's ankle, and just as they had named Esau after his appearance at birth, they named Jacob by this act of not wanting to let his brother get an advantage on him. And so they are Esau and Jacob, Hairy and Heel Catcher. Now that name, Jacob Heel Catcher, it has the connotation of one who trips someone, as in a race. A runner who's behind catches the runner in front by the heel, makes him fall so that he can take his place. And so the name, this word, Jacob, comes to be known as kind of a scoundrel, a schemer, a rascal, con man. Interesting names that Isaac and Rebekah picked for their children. Their names were true to the specifics of their birth, but how would you like to be stuck with a name like that growing up? Verse 27. And so the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. So Esau was a man's man, an outdoorsman, skilled at the hunt, a tracker who could read sign. Jacob seems to be kind of a mama's boy who liked to hang out at home. Verse 28. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So already there's trouble brewing. Whenever mom and dad play favorites, there's going to be conflict. Isaac liked barbecue, and so he favored Esau. Rebekah was partial to Jacob because he helped out around the house. He took up cooking, which is surprising because in that time, cooking really was a woman's work. Verse 29. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with some of that red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Red Edom. So Esau's been out hunting. He returns late, hungry, tired. He walks into the camp and smells red lentil stew boiling, and oh man, it smells so good. So he walks over to Wolfgang Jacob Puck and asks for a bowl. This earns him the nickname Edom, red, fitting also because he was redhead. Now, instead of just giving his brother a bowl of stew, Jacob decides to see what he can finagle him out for it. Jacob knows that Red is impetuous and sees this as a golden opportunity to get something he's desperately wanting. Verse 31. But Jacob said, sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die, so what is this birthright to me? And Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. And so he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose and went his way. And thus Esau despised his birthright. Esau wasn't about to die. He's exaggerating here. He could have asked any of the servants to make up something. And for sure, there was always bread handy, and so he could have snacked on that. But Esau was carnal, the kind of guy who wants what he wants when he wants it. And he wanted it now. Because Esau already had the promise of the birthright as the firstborn, he didn't value it. But Jacob did more than anything. He wanted it and decided to see if Esau would trade it for a bowl of bean soup. Esau did, because he was a fool. Now we're going to end it there, and we'll pick up the story in our next study.